I think it's about time to bring in the Russo brothers. So essentially, they're releasing their new movie.
Yes.
Called Cherry. It's available in select theaters now, but it's going to be on Apple TV Plus starting on March 12th.
The Russo brothers are two of the biggest directors in Hollywood, and they've directed Avengers Endgame, which is the highest grossing movie of all time. Crazy. Which is crazy. And they've also directed episodes and produced, episodes of Arrested Development, Community.
Two of my favorite shows.
Yeah, two great shows.
So yeah, they're going to join us today for an interview about their new movie Cherry, but also we're going to play a little game with them called The First Times, which is a Rolling Stone staple on our YouTube page. You can go check it out there if you want to see more episodes of that.
So chat, please. Can we get some emojis and a good welcome in the chat for Joe and Anthony Russo? Hi.
Hey, Joe and Anthony. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you guys?
Good.
How are you?
Hang it in. We're on set right now. We're prepping a movie called The Gray Man, and we start shooting in about 10 days.
Wow. Oh my God. Always working, huh?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Busy time for you all. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We're super excited to have you on the stream, and so is everyone in the chat. Yeah. So I guess just to start off, we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Cherry. We're all super excited to talk about it because we all really enjoyed the movie. And it is, based on a book. We wanted to start off just asking what drew you to the book and to the story behind Cherry.
It was a very personal decision to make that movie. We grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and the industrial Midwest, a little bit of a ground zero right now for the opioid crisis. We've lost family members to it. We have others who are struggling with their sobriety. So it's a very personal issue for us. And ultimately, to be honest, we made this movie for our kids. I've got kids between the ages of 15 and 24. And this was a movie that we felt was important to make to reach Gen Z, because we also feel like they are, in particular, most vulnerable to what's going on in the opioid crisis right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we definitely saw that come through in the movie too, and I think we both gave it a watch, and we loved it, by the way. But we saw that it took place in Cleveland, where you're both from. So I mean, I'm sure it really hit home to tackle a project like this. And also something we also noticed that we liked a lot was the soundtrack. You had Henry Jackman, composer, who worked on the soundtrack. I'm wondering if you could speak a little on how the music came together, and also if you've worked with Henry before, especially in that last, don't want to give anything away, but in the final sequence of how that soundtrack came together as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's a combination of elements. Certainly, we had worked with Henry on Captain America: Winter Soldier. It's the first time we had worked together, and then he had done Captain America: Civil War for us. And then we have a studio called Agbo that's produced a few films over the last 2 years, and Henry's done a number of those films, including 21 Bridges and a movie called Mosul for us. So we've done a lot of collaborating with Henry. And what we love about Henry is that his background was as a DJ before he became a composer. So he has a very experimental flair. He's very, very experimental taste, but that's combined with like a real thoughtful, real logic and a real emotional core as a composer. And we knew that what we were going to ask him to do on Cherry was going to be incredibly diverse and extremely experimental. And we knew he could handle the range that we were going to throw at him. And the other aspect of the music in the film are needle drops, and they're a little bit more sort of beat track, classic rock cues that to us are reminiscent of the feeling and the tone of Cleveland. Cleveland is the home of rock and roll. We grew up there. It's the kind of city where every city around the country has one classic rock station. Cleveland's got like 5.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important to the city. It's part of its identity is this idea that rock was born there, in the 70s were a preeminent period for Cleveland in that regard. And so we wanted to use music that reflected the soul of the city. And Van in particular, his cues were, having grown up in Belfast, there's sort of a kindred spirit there. And we felt like the folk, soulful aspects of his songs were really reflective of what we wanted the movie to feel like.
And I was wondering just what was the I'm sure it came with a lot of nuance. What was the approach to addressing PTSD in such a way that it was reflected on screen?
We wanted to be very truthful to it. It's again, like opioid addiction, PTSD is a real problem that people have, and it's a problem that's ongoing and in constant need of addressing in new and more effective ways. So we needed to be very faithful to it. We did a massive amount of research. Now, the book that the movie is based on, Cherry, by Nico Walker, Nico had a lot of life experiences that are similar to the characters in the book, in the sense that he did have an addiction, he did serve in the military, and he drew upon those experiences in writing about them. But on top of what we had in the novel to go off of, we also wanted to do a lot of research. So we consulted with a lot of people who are suffering from PTSD or addiction, loved ones of those who are suffering from PTSD and addiction, figuring out what it's like to live with those people and how you can sort of potentially help them or not, and the difficulties in that relationship. So I think it was not just us. Joe and I, it was the writers, and Tom Holland and Sierra Bravo were the two leads in the film. They spent a lot of time with people who have had these real life experiences, talking to them, understanding them, and then all of us coming together as the creative team behind the movie and figuring out how we take details from those real life experiences and sort of texture the movie with them. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of research, and I think at the end of the day, PTSD is it's a condition people have that's a reaction to trauma, and I think trauma is not unique to those warfare. There's a lot of trauma that people suffer outside of that context, right. And we all suffer in many different ways. And I think on that level, how the human soul sort of reacts to trauma, tries to move on from trauma, is weighed down by trauma. That was the part of the exploration that we wanted to have in this film. And I think it really applies to anybody, not just soldiers, even though they suffer from the condition in a very unique and specific way.
Mm-hmm. And I really think that research did come across. Mm-hmm. You could really tell, especially with Tom's acting, especially throughout the movie. I think people are going to be really enjoying that as well.
Yeah, he's great. He gave his all in that part. I mean, mm-hmm. he really shredded himself for the role. He lost 30 pounds to play those scenes where he, which is basically a quarter of his body weight. And it's physically draining. It's emotionally draining to be dealing with that subject matter every day, but also, while you're eating half a chicken breast, to maintain that weight, it's really difficult on an actor after a while, and to put yourself in that place for 4 months is tough.
Yeah, I mean, his acting definitely shone through in the film. He did an amazing job. And one thing we also noticed was he breaks the fourth wall a lot earlier in the movie and kind of speaking to the camera, speaking to the audience. But later on in the film, it doesn't necessarily happen as much, and you can see the tone kind of shifts throughout each part of the movie. How did you decide how to change the tone in each part? And, not to spoil anything for anyone, but what was kind of the thought process behind that?
I mean, the thought process was, it's a very subjective movie. In a lot of ways, he's an unreliable narrator. And part of why he stops talking as the movie progresses is that the narrative starts taking over. And he's imposing on the narrative less as it progresses. So he's left self-conscious as it goes on. We do think that, like, part of the problem that Gen Z faces is that, it's so self-aware, and there's such a conversation around everything that happens, and everything is analyzed, that it becomes like an echo chamber in a way. And, he says in the movie at one point, I felt like we were pretending the Army wasn't the Army, the drill sergeants weren't drill sergeants. And, there's this level of artifice that he can't escape because he's so self-aware of his own life. And so if you watch the film from his perspective as a narrator, the subjectivity is somewhat delusional. And he's a kid who suffers from depression. He's got social anxiety. So, you really have to analyze the movie as it progresses to understand what he's going through and whether, he's ultimately telling you the truth or not. What Anthony and I thought would be really compelling is if we broke the movie into the chapters, and presented it with very different tones, is because his life cycle is so unique and super intense. So they're very strange things, very strange experiences that happen to him over a 10-year period. And we thought it would be compelling to be disruptive and approach the narrative from a place of sort of bifurcation. Like how does he feel in each of these sections of the film, and then try to reflect that to the audience, try to shift the tone on them so that they feel the way he feels. So for instance, the first part of the film, he's falling in love, there's a level of magical realism to it. We use soft lenses, the lighting is done very specifically, it's a certain performance style, the music is done a certain way. And then he makes this sort of, very strange decision to join the army because he's been rejected by a girl. And he goes to the training for the army, and we close down the aspect ratio on him. We use a single wide lens to create a distorted view because he finds it wholly absurd. It's now changed his perspective on life. He's going to be, trained in a way that he feels isn't sufficient and will not prepare him for what he's about to go through. Then he moves to the war sequence. Now he's at war. Now we've changed the perspective again. And we're in longer takes now where you sit with this, naive character from Cleveland as he, as he goes into battle completely unprepared, physically, emotionally, training-wise, to deal with the horrors that he's about to see. And the movie progresses through chapters that way. And it's an experimental approach, but one that we felt, based on my experience with my children, would be, potentially attractive to Gen Z. Because if you think about the way that they consume information, you think of TikTok, you think of Instagram, everything is sort of segregated information coming at them in volume, right? And like significant volume, right? So you're going through your TikTok and you're looking at a review of a restaurant. Now you're looking at a band. Now you're looking at the stock market. Now you're looking at, it's just like an insane level of information that shifts on you constantly. And I think their brains are becoming adept at consuming that information at volume, but the expectation is also there to consume that way. And what's exciting about that to us is that we feel like there's real potential here to change the way that narratives are made. The 2-hour form is really prescriptive and confining in a lot of ways. And I think Gen Z is so advanced visually that, and from a narrative standpoint, and consumes so much that we're on the precipice of a dramatic shift that is exciting to Anthony as disruptors.
Yeah, and that's very cool. It did come across that way as well, because as Tia noted, every single part in the movie, from prologue to epilogue, everything had its own specific feel, your use of colors, and even your use of texts as well during the specific army scene that I'm thinking of, the boot camp scene, was kind of really jarring. It really brought you into a different story, but the same story at the same time. So it felt like just a bunch of different blips on the same timeline, which I thought made it very coherent and digestible as well.
Yeah.
So
that's great.
Yeah,
that's cool.
We definitely really, really enjoyed the movie. So thank you so much. We want to get into our next part of the interview as well. But for everyone in the chat, thank you all for speaking with us about Cherry specifically. And for everyone in the chat, Cherry is available in select theaters now, and it'll be on Apple TV Plus on March 12th. But for now, we're really excited to have you on to do, as we said earlier, one of Rolling Stone's longest running video series, The First Time. It's a little bit weird because we are live right now, so we're gonna have to ask you to kind of introduce it in a way, even though it's live. So if you all could just, really casually just say, hi, I'm Joe Russo, hi, and I'm Anthony Russo, and this is The First Time. It's gonna look great in post.
Okay, great.
Whenever you're ready.
You want to start, Al?
Hi, I'm Anthony Russo.
And I'm Joe Russo, and this is The First Time.
Beautiful.
Great. Didn't even call line once. Look at that.
Exactly. Thanks so much. Yeah, so we're just going to kind of get on into it. We're going to prompt you all with your first times, and then you guys just kind of take it away, But starting off, we just want to know, tell us about the first time you bought an album.
Wow. First time we bought an album. Can you remember, Anth?
Yeah, so when we were very young, we lived near on the east side of Cleveland, near a place called Shaker Square, and on the square they had a record store. We would ride our bikes up there, and we were very early on. We were Kiss fans. That was sort of the heyday of Kiss when we were growing up. So we would sort of, save up our money, and I remember, I'm sure it was a Kiss album. It was like one of the first albums we bought there.
It might have been one of the solo albums. It might have been Ace Frehley's solo album.
It's possible.
Groove, New York Groove on that one,
That's right.
Yeah, Rip It Out.
Yeah.
Great album.
Yeah.
Great selection, guys.
Yeah.
I'm a big Kiss fan too, so
That's cool. Yeah, I just remember spending a lot of time looking at Kiss album covers at a young age.
Very cool. And that kind of takes us to our next first time. Even, what was your first concert? First time you went to a concert?
Surprise!
Yeah. It was the Kiss concert. We were, I can't remember, Anthony. I think we were like in 3rd and 4th grade.
We were young, yeah.
And we loved them so much that our parents took us. Oh man, I'm going off the top on you. I'm sorry.
I think it was a Christmas present. The tickets were a Christmas present, and they took us and our older sister, not Angela, who wrote. Angela wasn't around yet, but our other sister. We all went to the Kiss concert together, which was extremely awkward, as you can imagine. To be
with
that.
Our parents took us, and I remember we couldn't hear for like 2 days after the show. I couldn't hear anything, and it was awesome because we were like in 3rd and 4th grade, and the whole row in front of us was just smoking pot the whole time. I remember it was like, so for like a first concert experience, we got everything.
Yeah, you really got it all.
And and we saw Gene Simmons breathe fire. So yeah, it was amazing.
Perfect. Spit the blood, breathe the fire.
The blood whole thing, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. It sounded like a very Merry Christmas for you guys.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Well, the next one, very relevant to right now. Tell us about the first time you fell in love with a movie or show.
Oh, that's a good question. First time we fell in love with a movie.
I remember, I'll say one, you can maybe think of a different one, but I remember, when we were young, we used to like to watch TV as a family, and our dad was really loved Taxi, the TV show Taxi, and we used to spend a lot of time watching Taxi with him. I remember like looking forward to that. And I think that show ended up being a big influence on Joe and I. It's just the idea, we love comedy. The idea of like an ensemble became very, like, a lot of our movies are ensembles. We like ensemble storytelling. And I think it's rooted in those great comedies like Taxi or Cheers, MASH, etc., that we were introduced to at a very young age. And the other thing I remember about those shows, like Taxi especially, is that we had like really great characters. Even though it was a comedy, it gave there were very distinct and memorable characters on the show that sort of had this sort of kind of chosen family with one another. And I think we grew up in a big Italian American family. We were used to having a lot of people around all the time and sort of everyone telling stories to one another. And I think those sitcoms were kind of in some ways reflective of our home experience as well on that level. Can you think of something else, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two sort of profound incidents for me from a pop culture standpoint as a kid. One was sitting in Empire Strikes Back for like 4 showings in a row, I think when I was 10 years old, and just spending the entire day at the multiplex watching it over and over because I couldn't leave, because I had such an emotional experience watching it. The other was something that came back that became a running gag on Arrested Development, but it was when Fonzie jumped the shark on Happy Days. That was like a huge moment in TV history where, like, this was when it was still appointment viewing and you had to like gather around the TV at a certain time on a certain night, which I'm sure seems like, the Stone Ages to most people. But I remember our entire family, getting in front of the TV 20 minutes before Happy Days started just so we could watch Fonzie, the part 2 episode of Fonzie jumping the shark.
What a lovely answer. I love imagining like little you going to the theater and watching. That is great. That's great.
That's great.
Our next one is, tell us about the first time you all shot something together.
That was our first movie, Pieces. I think it was in 1993. And we made a credit card movie in Cleveland, Ohio. We knew nothing about making movies. We read a book before we shot the film. And there was one guy in Cleveland who was a director of photography. So we called him and asked him to shoot the movie. And I remember the first day we rolled on our 16 millimeter camera that we had rented to shoot the movie. And just the sound of the film clacking through the magazine and you know, the experience of, like, you know, shooting actors playing a scene for the first time together is still very, very vivid in my brain. I even remember the smell of the film. You know, it's very different now because we use digital cameras, but back then film was such a tactile element, such a critical part of making movies.
And that movie was, you know, we spent a few years making that movie because you know, we were trying to do everything for free or very little money, and we had very little help making that film. So really what that movie ended up becoming for Joe and I was, it was our film school. You know, we learned how, like, every aspect of filmmaking by doing it through the process of making that movie over a long period of time. And that was a very pivotal experience in our lives. That's when we knew we were going to spend the rest of our lives making movies.
Wow. Cool. And going off that too, we also want to know what was the first time that y'all appeared in one of your shows or movies as a cameo?
It was also that film, Pieces.
Mm-hmm.
It was a family affair. Like, everyone in our family was, you know, part of the crew, helping out. And I was studying acting at the time, so I played one of the leads in the film. It was certainly cheaper to use me than it was to get someone else to play a part. And a couple of my buddies who were also in acting school at the time played some of the other roles in the film.
And that movie I was in, but Joe's a trained actor. I am not a trained actor, and I am not very comfortable in front of the camera. So that is the only movie I've ever appeared in of ours.
Wow.
And the scene that I appeared in that movie was a scene where it was the entire section of the scene that I was in was all shot in slow motion. So it's not real acting anyway. I just had to move. And, you know, anybody could do it. So that's about all I can manage as an actor.
It was some movie magic, though. You know, they made you look good.
Everybody looks good in slow-mo.
And going off of that too, we want to talk about personally one of my favorite projects that you guys have ever worked on. What was it like? What was your first time? Can you just walk us through the first time that you directed an episode of Arrested Development?
Well, the first episode we directed was the first episode of Arrested Development. So, so, you know, our process in television, whether it was Arrested Development or Community or Happy Endings, we would sort of approach them like a feature film. Which is where we would we basically approached the show like we were directing a movie. So we'd cast the show, design the show. Anything you would do with a feature. On Arrested, we worked very closely with Mitch Hurwitz, who wrote the show and created it. But it was a really amazing process because that was a difficult show to make. It was, you know, we were making that show at a time when what's called the single camera half-hour comedy, which is basically a comedy that's shot not in front of an audience like a sitcom, not in front of a live audience, but shot with a single camera, or essentially a single camera, like a film is, like a regular movie is. That sort of form of comedy on television was kind of dying out. And Ron Howard, who produced the show, really wanted to find a way to invigorate it. So they hired us. We were just coming out of the indie phase of our careers, and it was a big gamble to sort of give a network show to a couple guys like us. And but they really wanted our sort of guerrilla filmmaking style. And that ended up being the very first show that was ever shot on digital video, scripted show for primetime television in the United States. Everything prior had always been shot on film. So part of the innovation of that show was the process of actually shooting on digital video. And the reason we did that because we, you know, at the time, reality television shows were sort of becoming very, very popular and kind of knocking everything off out of the primetime spots because they were so popular and cheap to produce. So we took an approach on that show, which was basically, if you can't beat them, join them. And we decided to shoot Arrested like a mockumentary.
Yeah.
And so we embraced the look of the reality television show, and that became the style the show was made in, which I think we always thought was very clever and subversive because the show is completely absurd, but we shot it as if it was documentary real. And I think it's the incongruity of those two things that's part of the fun of the show.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I could always notice when you had the shaky cam in there, and you see it, you had all these pans and zooms on things mid-show. Yeah, it definitely did add to the show's aesthetic as being this ridiculous thing, but contained within like a seemingly normal box, I guess.
Yeah, we had a lot of rules on that show, and that's part of, I think, what defines the humor on Arrested Development is the idea that the cameramen could not lead the action; they had to follow the action. And what we mean by that is, if Job said a line, and then Jason Bateman said something in response, the cameraman couldn't go to Jason until he started speaking, right? And so usually you'd come into a reaction late or a joke late, and it created a rhythm for the show that was unique and really specific.
Cool.
Yeah, I love that. And that kind of, really intricate direction you can also see in shows like Community. So our next question was, tell us about the first time you directed an episode of Community.
That would have been a pilot of Community, which was the same thing. We met with Harmon. He had a great script. We partnered up to make Community, and both Community and Arrested were very, very difficult shows to cast. They took us months to cast those shows because the roles were so specific. And what I think we're really proud of is that the cast from both of those shows have gone on to do great things. But I just remember the casting process on that one in particular. And there's always one role or two roles that you can't figure out. And the role of Troy on Community was a particularly difficult role because it was originally written as a white jock, which felt a lot like that character from Election. And so, we were trying to find a way to, have a fresher take on the character. And we had seen these short films from a group called Derek Comedy a few months prior to casting Community. And Donald Glover was making these films with some friends of his while he was in NYU, and they were probably the funniest things we'd seen in like 10 years. And he was so funny in them that I remember Anthony saying, we've got to find something to do with him when we have the opportunity. And when we couldn't figure out Troy, after we'd seen a few people and it felt very familiar to us, we called Donald and said, would you be interested in improvising the character for us? And he put a bunch of stuff on tape, sent it out to us, and it was all brilliant. It was completely brilliant. And I remember when we would make that show, when we were making that show, that whenever you needed a comedic button on a scene, you just say, Donald, can you improvise a button? And it would always be the funniest button that anyone could come up with, writers or actors. So he was sort of a home run hitter for us on that. And I just remember that process because I went, oh, this is like sort of the dawning of a new era. And it's something we encourage young filmmakers and actors to do all the time is shoot things and post them on YouTube. It's free. Use your iPhone, use your creativity, create content, post it. I mean, it literally was like Anthony, somebody sent us a video. We looked at it, fell in love with Donald, and, cut to 10 years later. So there's incredible opportunity there for you to be discovered and for your talent to get noticed.
That's amazing. That's a great story. And I used to love those Derek Comedy videos, so that is great to hear. And I know, we just have a few more we want to run through really quickly just to hear from you all. But the first one being the first time you all built a superhero battle royale.
All right. It depends how you define battle royale, but that was probably Captain America Civil War would be the first proper superhero battle royale. At an airport, the airport in Germany that we shot at for when you have sort of Captain America's side taking on Iron Man's side in the split of the Avengers.
Nice. Thank you. And then next, the first time you all met Tom Holland.
So we were doing an audition for Peter Parker and the new Peter Parker. And Anthony and I were adamant, because that was one of my favorite characters growing up, that we cast a teenager in the part. And because the prior two actors who had played that part were both in their mid to late 20s when they did it. And we felt like something that was quintessential to, the essence of Peter Parker was his youth, and the fact that, as a kid, I would relate to him because he would make decisions that felt very real to me, and he felt like a high school kid making those decisions. So Tom Holland walked into the casting room. I think, we'd seen hundreds, if not thousands, of actors for the part. And I remember getting a call from our casting director, Sarah Finn, and she was like, he's coming in. I'm telling you that I found the guy. And Holland came in the room, and he was so charming and charismatic. He had that quality that, you can't replicate that as an actor. It's a movie star quality. It's just this like confidence and this charisma. And he was the nicest guy in the world, and he was super directable, and he had an incredible work ethic, and his range was amazing. And literally like 30 seconds in, we made up our minds. We looked at each other, and then, we went through the process to get him cast, and then, the rest is history.
And look at him now.
Yeah, look at him now.
With him.
And speaking of Tom Holland, too, our last question is in regards to Cherry. We wanted to know y'all's first time that you read Cherry, the book.
That was when we were in post-production on Avengers Endgame. So we're still editing the movie in the finishing stages. And somebody recommended a book to us. There was a book agent who said, knew our taste, knew we were from Cleveland, knew the city was really important to us. And they said, there's this book coming out that I can send you guys that you might respond to. And so we said, okay, we'll check it out. And we just really gave it a casual read while we were still editing, and we both fell in love with it. I mean, it's a very powerful, original voice. It felt very modern. It felt like a very modern experience of what drug use and addiction was. It felt like a very modern experience of what warfare was, and the experience of warfare was. We're big fans of cinema, and certainly both warfare and drug addiction has been explored very extensively in movies and literature, journalism, etc. But this felt like a very like a story we hadn't quite seen before, and because of what was going on in our personal lives with some friends and family members that were close to us, it just seemed like a story that we wanted to tell right now. So we basically, right after we read the book, we went right into the mode of acquiring the rights and then getting a screenplay written.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it really came through in the story that there was definitely a heavy influence from the book and from the text. And I do definitely agree that it is quite a modern take on opioid addiction and all of that. And, we know you guys have to actually head out now, which is, we sad to see you go, but
yes.
Thank you so much for being a part of this today, enjoying the first times.
Coming on straight from set. Thank you so
talking
much.
with us about your new movie, Cherry, which, again, for everybody that's not aware, in theaters, select theaters currently, next week, March 12th, coming on to Apple TV+. We hope you all tune into it.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us from set, too. So thank you.
Thank you. And sorry our internet was so bad. We've got 1,000 people all sharing the same internet.
No problem. We love a good mosaic look. It's okay.
But it was lovely to meet you guys. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much.
Thank you guys.